When we first organized these two sessions, we were very troubled about how to separate the two because, in fact, there were so many overlaps. And it seemed in the end that it would make a productive discussion to bring all of them together. Nevertheless, there were some key things that we felt were drawing together the next three papers, that by Katharina Borsi, Christopher Hight, and Roy Kozlovsky. If I can just sort of point out something that's probably obvious to most of you, Katharina is teaching here in the History and Theory program, and Chris, until unfortunately very recently, was also here with us at the AA. By that unfortunate thing, it's not unfortunate that he was here, it's unfortunate that it was only until very recently. Yeah. But I think in a way their papers sort of show the mark of the AA's strong focus on drawing as a strategy related to city building in a way that kind of courses through this place. And in a sense, what I think is happening in each of these two papers is that drawing is being interpreted as something quite strategic in relation to city building, but where the question of the subject of that building and the subject of that living in the city is taken very much to be a problem for itself. So that's one thing that I think links these two papers quite strongly. And a second is that there is running through these three papers a kind of tacit acknowledgement that there is a line between the 19th century and the modernism of the mid-20th century. That in fact we've often in our collaborations here been talking about that line as being constituted on a sort of liberal reason, a liberal reason about the problems of the subject in which the question of the domestic environment and the question of the urban environment are mapped, and where these come to be seen as problems relative to one another. So it's a sense in which the domestic is being mapped onto a problem of population, a problem of the mass, and in a way there's a passage of an argument about family and domesticity being passed on down to the question of population and the mass in the 19th century. Now that kind of fits with what Shawai suggests then, that when urbanism arises in the 1860s for the first time, that it then continues right on through and includes Corbusier and others. That is, there is no break, according to her, between the late 19th century and the post-war period. But now our latter two speakers, Chris Hight and Roy Kozlovsky, take up, in fact, precisely that post-war period and focus on it. And it raises the question of some of the continuities that Katharina's paper seems to try to establish by marking the transition from the 19th into the 20th. A fourth theme that we might find in this has to do with the way in which that subject that is, let's say, defined inside domestic space is dispersed onto a much wider field. And Roy Kozlovsky's paper takes that up by asking what happens when beat literature attempts to take on the question of domesticity in the widest of all possible environments, in a sense showing the way in which domestic life comes to be mapped upon a much, or perhaps not just much wider, but the widest of possible terrains extending across the United States and back as a kind of road story, and then reinserting itself back in the kitchen with Ginsberg's work on Howl. So first I'd like to turn by introducing Katharina Borsi, who teaches with us in History and Theory at the AA. Katharina.
Good morning. The way Foucault writes his history is always with an engagement about what we are today. And so what I'm trying to do today is to use the Berlin bloc of the 19th century as an example of shedding light for the reasons why we are all assembled here today. So in this aerial photograph of Berlin, you can see that the city is still very much defined by a 19th century form. And you can see that a lot of its quarters are still from the 19th century, but also there's a whole number of new developments which sort of take up the form of the bloc. So the bloc comes to be reintroduced, but it's not only a question in Berlin. You can also see in Paris, in Borsi, in the area around the Bibliothèque Nationale. So in a way, what it points to, independent of those attempts if they are successful or not, but somehow the bloc appears to continue to engage our reasoning about the urban and the domestic. So what we like about the Berlin bloc is the way in which it draws the spaces of the public and the private very closely together. And that is coupled to a very generous sense of space in its interior, which allows a very flexible use of it. So what you have is a whole series of uses very closely together, living, working, but such that those uses are interchangeable. So what happens that the space of the street very often is drawn into the interior of the block, while at the same time sometimes the life of the interior spills out onto the street. So when current architectural histories describe the block, they take it up as that which describes the emergence of modernism. And in almost all histories of 20th century architecture, you see images like that, in which the block comes to describe all the problems of the 19th century metropolis, against which modernism rises as the solution to. So if we take Alan Colquhoun as an example, he describes that when one sees these Mietskasernen today with their high densities and their labyrinthine and squalid courtyards, one suddenly understands the whole modern movement. As another example, we could look at Peter Rowe, which describes it as a courtyard form of the 19th century, which in its very closed and cellular form is characteristic of 19th century technology and urbanism, and not of the horizontal mobility and flexibility of 20th century cities. So on the one hand, those writings epitomize a sensibility in which the block is too dense, too compressed, and at the same time, if you read it as a representation of a closure, it's not dynamic and differentiated enough to make up the whole of the city for the 20th century. So but maybe it's best to look at Robin Emmons, which sort of comes to position those writings very well. He says, "No wonder that the apostles of modernity, who also expressed an unfathomable distaste for the stultifying oppressiveness of 19th century family life, were left with only two possibilities. The first was to dissipate the clammy heat of intimate relationships by collectivizing them. The second, more applicable to the house, as it turned out, was to atomize and individualize and separate each person yet further. Here we have two solutions, the one ultimately politic, the other ultimately private. From a certain angle, they appear remarkably alike, so it was quite logical for Le Corbusier, Hilbersheimer, and the constructivists to use the individual private cell as the basic building block for entire new cities in which all other facilities would be collectivized." So on the one hand, what Evans points to is their ground of argumentation is one of the 20th century in which housing and urbanism are already spatially differentiated, and it becomes cast back on the 19th century spatiality. However, more interestingly, he traces a continuity of a sense in which intimacy and sensuality is sort of coupled with a sense of dynamism, and he sees it as a problem internal to the home. And I think it's that linkage that we also find so intriguing in the account of Michel Foucault in The History of Sexuality and Jacques Danselot in The Policing of Families. In their account, the rise of the family is precisely the setting where the cultivation of an intensity, dynamism, and autonomy comes into being. So they describe the rise of the family as a response to a number of problems that confront the liberal government, and especially Danselot points out the way in which it became a mechanism that pursues a number of aims about health and welfare of the overall population, but without overextending the domain of state law. So the bonds of marriage were sort of reconstructed along two different lines according to class. But in each case, what is set up was a differential set of relations that on the one hand unified the family, but also set up relations of responsibility that sort of came into being in conjunction with an autonomy of each individual. So if Foucault and Danselot are right, then the carving out of the domestic space, the interiorization or the withdrawal, is necessary to fulfill the family's promise. So this space then is not one simply of oppression or stultification, but it's constituted as intensely ambivalent. So it's the idea of the home as a guarantor for securing autonomy that allows the very possibility of creating this stultification. So there's both the constitution of the family as a norm and its continuous critique, a relation internal to its mechanism. So where Robin Evans sort of sees this continuity, on the one hand, on the other hand, he sort of takes himself out of that equation. He critiques the modernist home as sort of stifling for a carnal sensuality, and he traces a line of connection which is a bit different from what we heard previously. He says there's a shift from the interconnected spaces in Palladio's villa to the introduction of the corridor in the 17th century, all the way to the frictionless house by Klein. And for him, obviously, this increasing separation and delineation of spaces is that which sort of oppresses our still existing desire of mingle flesh with flesh in the spaces of Palladio. Now, following Danselot and Foucault, this distinction between Colquhoun, Rowe, and Evans is on the same terrain. Because the subject that so eagerly pursues the liberation through the sensuality of the body is that which comes to be problematized in and through the configuration of the domestic. So seen in this light, we can see similarities in the way Colquhoun feels a squeamish claustrophobia in the interior of the block, the way Rowe pursues the dynamism he wants to see transgressing across the city, and also Evans' nostalgic desire for transgressing the boundary. So as Foucault says in History of Sexuality, power is immanent to our reason. So the very moment we imagine we can liberate ourselves by overcoming the norm of the family, and the very moment we problematize the distinction between public and private, is the moment when power is at work, and we are what we ought to be, the liberal subject. So this is the side from which this drama unfolds, if you want. Or more precisely, it's a transition in the spaces of the block, in which we can see the emergence of the continuous problematization of the public and the private. So what you see here are some sheets of Assmann's Model Book of Urban Houses, published in 1862. And it is a pattern book which describes the various possibilities in which you can fill a city block. And I'm afraid they are a bit small, but what you can see, those spaces do not really illuminate the domestic space of the family. On the one hand, there is an idea of dwelling in them, but the way the units, the spaces are sort of coupled together, you can see there's not an idea of a self-containment of flats. Some of those buildings you have to transgress other spaces to go to the next unit. On the other hand, you don't have a corridor. So the way the spaces are linked together are just sort of by a matrix of rooms, so you pass through from one space to the other. Also, what's quite interesting, when Assmann describes these buildings, the construction technique he sort of indicates, on which is the practice at the time, that you have a solid shell and core building with flexible partitions. And also all the load-bearing walls had lintels such that you can easily add and subtract spaces. And secondly, his main point is that all the space should be relatively generous and undifferentiated, because the main function of this building is to accommodate a big number of people and a changing population of users. So in a way, this is maybe not so much a collection of houses as we know them today, but I think it's part of an infrastructural system that comes to be generalized with the publication of the Hobrecht Plan in 1862. So if you look at the drawing of the plan, the way Hobrecht presents it, he casts the space of the city as full. You see the new building fabric is sort of a carpet of stone which extends from the Baroque and medieval core of the city. And it has a relative regularity and uniformity. So there is no differentiation in terms of function and use. What you see here is a number of building applications from the 1870s, 1860s, And at the bottom right is the contemporary rendering of the cut at ground level, where you can see this big porosity between the interior and the exterior of the urban block. So in a way, what I described as the full space of the city of Hobrecht is more a series of voids which come to spill into each other. So from the smaller scale of the room to the larger scale of the city, all those spaces have a relationship to each other, and where the dividing line are sort of flexibly definable. They're not definite. So just as Larry mentioned before, it's very similar to the way Francois Schry describes Derrida's understanding of urbanism. It's a city of fluctuating boundaries and endlessly mobile population, which corresponds very much to the change of population in Assmann's book. What that means that around the 1860s, for the first time, we have a conceptualization of the urban in which the home and the city is linked, and it's describable and it's comparable, so it's a type. Also, the moment this huge machinery came to work, the moment it really emerged and became operational, obviously there were a lot of number of problems specific to it. So we can see that from the 1860s onwards, the rise of the city, its growth and densification was accompanied by a whole set of observation and registrations. So there's a whole avalanche of reformers who sort of marches into the city and sort of pins down all the details about the ways in which one could sort of alleviate the problems of the poor, for example. But there's a lot of writings in the governmentality tradition which says that the success of these reform movements is not so much based on the success of the interventions, but the very fact of their amassing of a knowledge about the population and urban social patterns. Because what allowed that to happen is that you have a knowledge about the city, about its strengths and weaknesses, and to govern accordingly. Now, the problem of the definition of the domestic space, I think, does not really emerge on that scale, on the bottom left. It doesn't, not on the scale of the interior, but I think it's more that scale. So you can imagine the bourgeois reformer in the 19th century standing in front of this looming mass of the facade, and seemingly in the interior there's an innumerable dense mass of people and activities going on. So in all the description we have problems of overcrowding, contagion, immorality. So what becomes problematized is the idea of influence and association. But obviously the real problem is the possibility of government inside that space. Because in a way, because it's so impenetrable, there's no way of making specific interventions possible. So the interior of the block around the 1880s began to respond to some of those problems, and we can see increasingly slowly how the spaces become more defined. So we see the introduction of the corridor, we see that a sanitary space become introduced into the plan, and it becomes more generalized that you have self-contained flats. So however, originally I thought there's two new scales that come to emerge in the city, the scale of the domestic and another scale which hollows out the space of the block. But really what's quite interesting is only one new scale that emerges, and that's the scale of the neighborhood or of the district. On the left-hand side you can see a district from the 1970s. And what you can see that the blocks are kind of filled by a repetitive fabric. On the right-hand side, on the other hand, you can see that the outline of the block and plan is already a lot more defined, and you can see there's a differentiation from the quarter from its surroundings. So at the beginning of the 19th century, the block is still existing, but it performs entirely differently. So the lines that previously just notated the unfolding of spaces, they now really delineate separations. You can easily see that now there's separation from the street to the interior to the courtyard. And you can imagine at the bottom right that there's hardly any possibility for industrial uses in those spaces. On the right-hand side, I think what this drawing makes quite clear is it's problematized. It's the scale of the neighborhood. Yeah. So it's that very moment we sort of try to problematize again the association we have lost, only on a different level. So in that sense, we can come back to Larry's opening introduction. So on the one hand, you have Francois Schry's argument that there's a figure that comes to underlie all theorizations of the urban throughout the 20th century. On the other hand, what Rowe and Colquhoun stand for is a very different spatiality from the 1860s to the 1910s. However, as we've seen previously, there's only a switch. What continues is a problematization about the urban and the domestic. If Foucault and Dancelot are right, then our desire to transgress the line emerged coextensively with the idea of the family. However, the subjects we are reasoning about this are the ones that emerged in the home. One might thus agree with Sennett, who in his Fall of Public Man sees it as a generalized condition. The very idea of the intimate metropolis is the description of a predicament of our time. Thank you.
Thank you, Katharina. Our next speaker is Christopher Hight, and Christopher's paper title. How much time do you need to set up? Should I make this a long introduction or short introduction? Katharina. Let's start. Oh wait, we're still waiting for Marina, I think.
The organizers.
We're waiting for the organizers.
I don't know. Yeah, this is mine. I have this like tiny glass of water here.
Yeah. Welcome back, everyone. I'd like to introduce next, once again, Christopher Hight, who is now at Rice University in Houston in the United States. And Christopher will be talking about Corbusier's Unités and the Golden Lanes project by the Smithsons. The title is Unités and Golden Lanes, Instruments for Domesticating the Post-War Metropolis. Please welcome Chris Hight.
Thanks. In 1947, Le Corbusier presented two diagrams of ideal cities. One was of Renaissance Milan, the other depicted a contemporary condition of proto-blob urbanism. Through them, Le Corbusier attempted to document how the organically ordered and bounded city was ruptured, bleeding into the countryside, and had become less like a body and more, in his words, like an amoeboid protoplasm or a mutant abortion. At the time, Le Corbusier located the causes of the city as a body without organs in a panoply of events, ranging from World War II, changes in technology, changes in real estate development, and economic policies. But by 1948, when he completed major work on Le Modulor, all these causes were seen as merely epiphenomena in a far broader reorganization of culture and technology, the onset of a network civilization. Like the twin diagrams of the city, Le Modulor contained two diagrams of this transformation. The first is a map of Europe featuring discrete nation-states, connected by hierarchical trade routes and migration routes. Territorially bounded, Eurocentric, and hierarchical, like the traditional city, this world is an architectonic body organized along a spine of trade. The second diagram presents something radically different. The world as a network of products, commerce, and information flows. Metropolitan nodes and global connectivity supplanted the territories of the nation-state, and trade routes have become non-hierarchical webs of communication and commerce. In short, Le Corbusier diagrams what Michael Hart and Antonio Negri have termed empire, their delirious vision of our present geopolitical condition as an endless network, quote, characterized fundamentally by a lack of boundaries, either geographical, political, or even historical. Le Corbusier argued at the dawn of this of this new empire that, quote, a visual measure has become really imperative only in recent years, when high-speed means of communication have worked a profound change in the relationship between peoples. Everything is becoming, indeed has already become, interdependent. Here is a full-fledged vision of a World Wide Web, a network civilization organized by bandwidths of communication and free trade rather than geographic proximity. Yet, like Hight and Negri, who call empire the enemy which they stand and resist against, Le Corbusier called this global network the problem of our day. As critics of globalization claim today, for Le Corbusier, the network of flows of the late 20th century and its capital was seen as dangerously dislocated from an a priori subjective and corporeal comprehension, let alone in the individual's agency in relationship to these flows. Indeed, the rupture of containment and boundedness for Le Corbusier did not lead to a world of transparency and openness, but to a schizophrenia of total connection. Hence, the job of architecture, according to the Modulor, was to become, quote, a container of men, to contain space, and through this contain the subject against the unbounded network of capital and products. The Modular books are filled with metaphors and illustrations of packing crates, suitcases, and sarcophagi. For example, a remodeling of his office on Rue de Sèvres, based on the Modular, is likened to a shipping container. The architecture is almost a close-fitting secondary skin, ergonomically and phenomenologically. The Modular and its architectures was to serve as a prosthesis, binding the effluent body of the subject and the city against the buffeting forces of globalization. Moreover, like Hight and Negri, who see the only possibility for resisting the contemporary empire in the mass appropriation of its global networking infrastructure, the Modular would have operated within the flows in commerce and communications in a universalizing manner. Accordingly, it was to have replaced the metric and imperial systems of measurement in order to harmonize the flow of the world's goods, in Le Corbusier's terms. And it was to be applied to all products of technological production, from machines to vehicles to architecture to the bolts and components and tools that assembled these machines. Because the Modular was seemingly derived from human scale, Le Corbusier argued this measuring measure would harmonize what he saw as the otherwise out-of-control global network with the intimate psychological and physiological conditions of the human subject. In this condition, architecture itself becomes a problem of packaging, of redefining the boundaries between the extensive flows of capital and contained interiorities of subjects. It becomes a redrawing of the subject. It could operate as a global infrastructure to control not only production, but also the subjects of that production. The effluent network would be disciplined by modular grids, bound up as an orthopedic body. This was actualized as an architectural and urban problem as mass-produced housing after World War II. Le Corbusier long believed that architecture was an apparatus for the training of subjects into proper mindsets for modernity. His pre-war projects repeatedly described modernist domestic space as a playground to create new sorts of collectives and new sorts of subjects suitable for modernity, a training ground. But if by World War II, this idea had become problematically unbounded by the dynamics of global capital, then the spaces of privacy were the most critical sites of this violence. This is the epistemological context in which the Modular's most famous application, the unité de habitation, must be situated. Le Corbusier was fond of showing diagrams that presented the unité as a frame holding discrete units, and frequently employed the metaphor of a bottle rack to describe its organizational logic. This has led many to critique the unité for an anonymity of its units, seeing in its ethos of mass production and uniformity hundreds of isolated subjects. But this forgets that the unité is not actually organized like an undifferentiated grid or a bottle rack, but along a spinal circulation route, in which there is a hierarchy and single path from ground level to each unit, to the mid-building shopping street and up to the roof terrace. The unité's anthropomorphism is a resistant synodote to the condition of the city and of the world as an effluent network. Moreover, the unité was understood not as a single project, but ultimately as a general urban system, one haltingly implemented in the reconstruction of European cities and new American and Asian expansions. Unlike La Ville Radieuse, the fabric of the unité is no longer connected by a park, but drifts in drifts in a landscape of empire, suggesting an inability to conceive of urbanism in terms of public space, because the space as container model was a reaction to the crisis in the nature of boundaries themselves between public and private. Amidst the flows and fluxes of capital and technology, the unité was an intersection of nodes within a network, increasing the density of these nodes until urbanism became an endlessly circulating and nested interiority. This intense interior unity is then nested and repeated hundreds of times in each unit. In turn, a metropolis made up of the unité system would be one of multiple discrete inward-looking nodes, or centers, placed on a loose grid network. The landscape becomes the space of unfettered flows between these micro-city states, and its super-subject represented as the building. The utopian project of pre-war modernism, in which the entire bound city was to be converted into a freeing modern terrain, has now been involuted on itself. If utopia was unrealizable as a coherent corpus in extension as the city, at the unité, utopia is condensed into fortified points. Therefore, at the unité, the lost possibility of urbanism is condensed firstly into the interior of a single building, and secondly into the interior of the units. The differences between Golden Lane and the unité can best be approached through their differing relationships to images of nature and natural ordering. In Le Corbusier's reference to the golden section spirals and mathematicians and natural forms, and the Smithson's involvement with the Parallel of Art and Life exhibit at the ICA. Parallel in Art and Life of 1953 was an exhibit curated in part by the Smithsons and consisted primarily of large images of natural forms juxtaposed with similar images of cultural formations, from settlements to indigenous art to technology. These images were often the same as those across which Le Corbusier might have inscribed the modular or the golden section or a logarithmic spiral as evidence of a transcendental presence of a mathematical order in all the works of nature and culture. Indeed, in the 9th Milan Triennial of 1951, Le Corbusier instigated an exhibit which was a response largely to the sheer overwhelming popularity of his book, The Modular, and also Rudolf Vidkover's Architectural Principles, in which images of shells, pine cones, and also famous works of art and architecture were exhibited, and then a geometric filigree was inscribed over them, showing how a certain system of proportions is evidenced time and time and time again. Just as Le Corbusier drew regulating lines over architecture in Vers une Architecture and Le Modular. Le Corbusier also invoked geometers such as Gaika, who espoused proportions like the modular and the golden section permeated works of nature and culture. What was important was the underlying geometrical principles, at once transcendental and eminent, and unearthed by overlaying diagrams. Gaika famously overlaid a photo of a woman's face with geometric figures to demonstrate how her beauty was based on the golden section. It's fantastic, which then becomes a plan. Le Corbusier wielded the modular very similarly to a whole set of possible architectures and sculptures. Robin Evans has noted that why Gaika hoped to argue that this overlay demonstrated the presence of the golden section in natural forms and sort of natural aesthetics. He says, quote, Gaika's analysis is not of the robust, rotund, undulating, folding, punctured surface we call a face, but of quite another surface, onto which the face was flattened by the process of photography. What Gaika actually did, in other words, was to overlay a geometry over a two-dimensional image of the face, turning the three-dimensional topologies of the face into a geometric architectonic facade. This suggests an uncritical naturalization of planimetric projective geometry rather than evidence geometries of formation natural or cultural. In Parallel of Art and Life, the confusion Evans detected in Gaika's work, and by extension in Le Corbusier's Modular, is turned on its side and mobilized as an agent. The Smithsons were far more skeptical of proportioning systems such as the golden section and the modular, and were very active in debates that occurred in England at the time. As Banham described, for them, proportional geometry was only an ad hoc device for the realization of, quote, images, and parallel in art and life enabled the brutalists to define their relationship to the visual world in terms of something other than geometry. In the exhibit, the superposition of geometric lineaments with natural forms found at the ninth triennial and in Geica's work is avoided at all costs, even though many of the images are very related. Instead, photographic techniques such as grain, dramatic enlargement, intense contrast, and shadowing are used to emphasize not the order of the thing in itself and its underlying ordering principle, but the thing as mediated. While through the modular, Le Corbusier was seeking a whole order via the traits of geometry, the Smithsons were striving to precipitate architecture wholly into the order of the image. What was sought was not the underlying order of nature or cultural forms, but the immanent imago, a virtual surface upon which all possible identifications of similarity are configured, one that gives significance to our ideas of order, natural, cultural, psychological, or otherwise. Similarly to their treatment of natural forms, Le Corbusier and the Smithsons deployed differential architectures of representation, and in different ways. Yet in this case, their positioning is reversed. Le Corbusier argued that one of the advantages of the modular was that its algorithmic progression of proportion was not unlike the diminishing grids of linear perspective, a sort of specious link that is actually fantastical. That, and the idea that the modular referred to the position of the eye in a standing body, led Le Corbusier to suggest that the use of the modular would lead to an empathic symphonia of subjective perception with the world as perceived if it was constructed through the modular. Through the modular, our sensorial schema would be properly aligned with things represented. This can be seen in the plan of the Unité's apartment, essentially long rectangular lenses that produced hundreds of discrete images of the landscape beyond, each one gridded by a modularized fenestration. Like Geica's woman's face, this landscape was transformed into a picture, a surface gridded by the modular. Hence, the subject sees the world as picture, a perspectival picture, for which the modular provided a regulatory frame or schematic container. Perspectival representation played just as important a role in the Smithsons project. Indeed, Banham's reading of their project as topological, which is a sort of strange moment in the writing that's left completely underdeveloped. He throws it out as their architecture is topological and then doesn't explain it at all. This reading depended almost entirely on its presentation through perspectival representation. He argued that the Golden Lane housing project was, quote, notable for its determination to create a coherent visual image by non-formal means, unquote. Banham went so far to describe such work as exhibiting an intuitive sense of topology, in which interior and exterior are displaced by connectivities of circulation routes, linking, quote, topologically similar spaces. Ironically, he demonstrated this assertion primarily by appealing to the Smithsons' extensive use of photo collage perspectives. And one of the striking things in retrospect about these perspectives is how they are ordered like the photographs in the Parallel of Art and Life exhibit, which show a complex field of interaction between the images of diverse scale and size, transforming a room into a matrix-like space. Similarly, the photo collages of Golden Lane are not perspectives insofar as we understand them in a traditional sense, but graphical interfaces. Graphical interfaces that order things according to changing hierarchies that are entirely dependent on one's relative location within their field. In this graphic space, the center is relative, but the linkages and agencies determined by a global force. In fact, the effect is very similar to today's force-directed graphs increasingly used in computer interfaces, such as the image on the bottom of the interface called, quote, the brain. These alter the size and location of information based on the relative position of that information to the subject, which is located by implication at the center of the interface field. In these representations, it is clear that spatial illusion is far less important than the organizational effects as images, as graphical interfaces. An invisible but real network spreads across the surface of the image, relating the montage figures to the architecture in a way not unlike the urban plans suggest the building affiliates to the existing built environment as a connective tissue. The perspectives of Golden Lane, in many ways, owe less to Alberti than to medieval compositions, which determine the size of things by their cosmological rank. Only here, they are no longer determined by the presence of God, but by the location of subject within a mutating field. Here, the subject is not a lonely eye secreted in a containing cell, but a cut-out photograph montaged into the space of the image, triangulating the architecture with activity and lifestyle. If Gaika and Le Corbusier turned complex topologies into geometric images of architectonics, the Smithsons promised an informatic concept of ordering in which the surface of the image becomes a convoluted topology. With this in mind, we can return to the proposed urbanism and the implications of the two projects. In many ways, Golden Lane employs almost the same elements as the Unité: a set of housing blocks, configured along circulation spines, and a separation of existing ground planes from hierarchies of circulation. And both were in a way prototypes for mass-produced housing systems and for suburban expansions of the post-war metropolis, attempts to deal with these conditions. But like the topological transformation of a torus into a coffee cup, Golden Lane transformed the containing corpus of the modular and turned it inside out. The Unité's spinal interior streets become multiple exterior platforms. The quasi-structural grid, which held the interlocked cells in Le Corbusier's building, become trays, holding sub-trays of living areas, each of which has immediate access to the global network rather than a predetermined circulation path. The Unité's body is split, twisted, and sheared into an asymmetrical pinwheel, as you can see in that image. Staircases are no longer hierarchical access points to spines of circulation, but multiple connective tissues to essentially continuous surfaces. The same operation continues at the scale of the units. The Unité's apartments are organized as linear apertures, as I suggested, while Golden Lane's flats are centrifugally organized as multiple centers, each room topologically similar to the next, each plan topologically similar to the adjacent. At the opposite scale, this transformation is replayed in their urban diagrams, the Unité offering discrete points drifting in a landscape, while Golden Lane promises an extensive network, breaking symmetry to affiliate with the existent built environment and its infrastructural connections. In short, while the Unité loads everything into an isolated, nested node, the entire building and the cells become nodal. A node buttressed against a network flux. In Golden Lane literally concretizes the multiple vectors of the network's connective tissue. If the Unité's wholesale interiorization as a strategy against the dissolution of the urban, social, and political boundaries and the subject, then Golden Lane's topological image order began to provide a figure for a networked urbanism of extensive, intimate connections. This shift from point to vector is more than a minor adjustment, although both the Unité and Golden Lane are central projects in the historical and stylistic movement of new brutalism and appeared relatively simultaneously. They have rather different implications. In Golden Lane, the oikos is not a container for the subject, but merely a relay node of intersection between the vectors of communication, while the Unité's circulation and structure operates as an organizing spinal or skeletal system that defines this object's containing order, and Golden Lane, roughly the same syntax, became a folded and extensive surface, traversing interiority and exteriority. At a more conceptual level, it is clear that these categories are not really adequate in describing the operations of the plan. If the bounded Greek polis once delineated the citizen from the barbarian through its walls of interiority, and if the centralized space was to have provided a figure for the body politic of the people or the king in terms of the town square, And if the modern city suggested an anomie, there is in Golden Lane hardly a division between the private subjects and public citizens in the global network. Such networks are boundless, but also local at all points. As the unites modular trace the limits of the public-private dichotomy, structured via domestic interiority versus an urban exteriority, at Golden Lane these conventional dichotomies are rendered rather moot in favor of an expansive distributed field. In the most famous of Golden Lane's perspectives, one can detect a small figure in the top right-hand corner that appears to be the modulor, waving goodbye at the margins to a world that is fading away, himself now a minuscule representation of liberal subjectivity and universality. He's staring in a world of boundaries fading away. It's no wonder that similar topological boundaries to that of Golden Lane were adapted by Constant for his New Babylon's proposals. They provide an imago of the ludic space in which boundaries between subject and object are completely deterritorialized in favor of a field of transformation and liberation. But such architecture should not be misconstrued as necessarily more liberating. The Smithsons argued in an unpublished book in the late 1970s that post-colonial immigration threatened the social and urban fabric of England, in part because of the universalizing intentions of housing fabric. They said, quote, "In England at the present time, provided housing tends to pack together, without distinction, families of completely different standards of cleanliness, noisiness, obtrusiveness, and so on," unquote. The result, they argued, is an unhappy, or rather unproductive, quote, "violent consumer." At the same time, they declared that, quote, "we cannot come upon any new reason for making urban, communal, outdoor spaces." In other words, there is no reason, there is no imagination that's possible for making public space. And they continue, quote, "all we know is that people no longer use and no longer imagine how to use, except by standing around as tourists of these public spaces, which with any sense of collective possession." In other words, the entire urban public realm has been balkanized into a series of post-colonial identities. Their response is to group ethnicities and classes in the separate and formally differentiated archipelagos, linked via a mediating space, rather like the platforms at Golden Lane. This peace plan, a sort of West Bank strategy to the balkanization of London, is mediated by a tertiary, non-public, non-place. This is the network. In this light, the Smithsons architectures become a controlling apparatus that supplants the need for disciplinary instruments like Le Corbusier's modulor and its unité. It domesticates the violence of the post-colonial consumer, such that his or her actions are to become productive within the global network, and whose resistance, like the riots accompanying the WTO meetings today, become a spectacle enjoyed by the global tourist of urbanism. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Our next speaker is Roy Kozlovsky, and his topic will be beat literature and the domestication of American space. So we'll hear Roy's paper, and then all 6 speakers from these 2 sessions will come up for a discussion section following this paper now. Roy Kozlovsky, thank you.
My paper aims to conceptualize beat literature as a special project by reassessing its 3 seminal texts, Jack Kerouac's novel On the Road, Allen Ginsberg's poem Hall, and William Burroughs' novel Naked Lunch, in terms of our engagement with space in the 3 distinctive scales of the continental, the urban, and the domestic. As the mapping of the road trips that make up On the Road demonstrates, the novel could be conceptualized as a motorized survey of American continental space. It traces 4 actual road trips that Kerouac made right after the war, when he intentionally chose to live on the road and explore the continental scale of American space. In a letter he wrote before leaving home, Kerouac explained the literary motivation behind this enterprise. I have begun a huge study of the face of America itself, acquiring maps of every state in the USA, and before long, not a river or mountain, peak or bay, or town or city will escape my attention. My purpose is Balzacian in scope, to conquer knowledge of the USA. My purpose is to know it as I know the palm of my hand. It's the difference between an European culture of turmoil, resentment, and interhuman struggle, and an American culture of livelihood, purpose, land, and natural struggle. It is significant that Kerouac concluded that in order to adapt the Balzacian literary project to his modern American context, literature must be detached from the social and engage with the spatial. This choice to spatialize literature might appear as apolitical in its privileging of space over time, geography over history, the natural over the social. The aim of my paper is to demonstrate that the Beat Spatial project was indeed political when conceptualized in relation to the post-war reorganization of American space. In the post-war period, American society was restructured by 2 complementary spatial tendencies. It was decentralized by technologies such as highways, broadcast television, and the dispersions of the means of production and social reproduction from the city to its suburban periphery. At the same time, the management of these technologies became consolidated into a diminishing number of big corporations and government agencies. As a consequence of this process of centralized decentralization, American society was restructured into 2 spatial scales, the continental and the domestic. On the one hand, it was fragmented into discrete autonomous units of the nuclear family, and on the other hand, it was economically integrated into a unified consumer economy. In light of this transformation of what constitutes public space, Beat literature raises the question of how to be political when the concept of the political itself has been altered. The Beat Spatial project can thus be conceptualized as the contestation of the domestication of American space as a means for reclaiming political space. In their critique of domestication, Beat writers follow a central trope of American literature, in which the quest for an egalitarian collectivity and individual liberty is set in opposition to the sphere of domesticity. This mode of discourse evolved out of the context in which the American cult of domesticity has historically emerged in the 19th century. Its aim was to carve a bounded space of moral sanctuary out of the chaos and materialism of a rising urban culture, as well as to mitigate class conflict by initiating workers and immigrants into home ownership. Reverend William Eliot, an early promoter of domesticity, argued in a sermon delivered to an all-female assembly that, quote, "The strength of our country is found not in the declaration that all men are free and equal, but in the bonds which unite together in the family circle. The cornerstone of our republic is the hearthstone," end quote. This new social space was engendered as feminine, while the public and conflicted space of labor and production was coded as masculine. Responding to the anti-political and gendered constitution of domesticity, American male writers such as Herman Melville and Mark Twain would make their characters flee home in order to recuperate the egalitarian potential of American democracy. Melville employed the ocean-bound ship as an alternative masculine community to the hearth and the family. Twain posed the raft along the Mississippi River as the utopian space of male companionship, set in opposition to the home that stands for slavery and Christian morality. Likewise, Kerouac employs the car on the highway as a critique of post-war domestication. Previously fragmented and regional in character, the various highways on the state level were integrated into a nationwide system during the Second World War. Kerouac, who was employed during that war in the construction of the Pentagon, the very embodiment of decentralization of power, would turn after the war to examine the decentralized space of the highway. The dispersed geography of on the road was made possible by another post-war policy, the GI Bill, which provided the material base for organizing American everyday life upon middle-class domesticity. as it financed both the construction of single-family homes and access to higher education. Kerouac exploited the GI Bill to sustain a nomadic lifestyle outside the capitalist economy, and its periodic installments determines the novel yearly cycle of road trips. They all point westward. Eastern Europe. All point westward, away from home and history, as means of exploring new forms of collectivities and identities. It is useful to distinguish between those driving sessions where the narrator hitchhikes or uses public transportation, such as this session from Chicago to Denver, which is broken into 8 different driving sessions, and when he has individual control of the car. For example, from New Orleans to San Francisco in one driving session without non-stop driving, and with one driver as well. When the means of movement are collective, he participates with the otherness of nomadic and homeless populations such as hobos, Okies, and migrant workers. For Kerouac, their way of life embodied the ideal of beatness in their rejection of materialism and the capitalist work ethic. Their lack of home allows them to generate more flexible models of communality outside the framework of domesticity and establish a more harmonious relation with nature. What was for Kerouac a matter of ethical choice was imposed upon them by historical circumstances beyond their control. As millions of Americans became dispossessed and uprooted by the Great Depression, the shifting demands of the war economy, and post-war demobilization, Kerouac surveys the geography of homelessness only to idealize it as a form of resistance. But when the narrator and his male companion, Dean Moriarty, have control of mobility, the more individualizing aspects of the car come into play. A central trope of On the Road is the pleasurable and liberating experience of accelerated driving, posed as a means for escaping the social in favor of the spatial. Quote, "Here we go," yelled Dean, and he hunched over the wheel and gunned her. That's the car. We all realized we were leaving confusion and nonsense behind and performing our one and only noble function of the time, move. And we moved, end quote. Although the novel poses the car as an instrument of liberation, Kerouac is careful not to fetishize the car as a commodity. He forwards the notion that the car should be shared and then destroyed in a potluck fashion, rather than function as a marker of identity and wealth. And each road trip ends with the car being destroyed, and then we just take the bus. The experience of driving on the highway was employed by Kerouac to spatialize the very act of writing. Kerouac wrote the entire text of On the Road in 20 days, typing directly on rolls of architectural drafting paper, compiling a 120 feet long scroll. Typing on a scroll corresponds to the linearity and uninterrupted motion of driving on the highway. Kerouac termed this approach to literary production, which denies editing or revising, as spontaneous prose. Keeping with the American literary tradition of employing means of transportation as an alternative to the home, Kerouac turns the car, which was advertised in the 50s as an extension of domesticity, with the comfort and also connecting, the cars connecting is something that connects homes, into the alternative intimate space to the house, where male companionship can be reestablished outside the sphere of feminine domestication. The car is posed as a communication machine that can recuperate the archaic function of the tribal hearth. Quote, "Stan swung into his life story as we shot across the dark. Chad King was somewhere off the road in front of campfire, and he too was telling his life story, and never dreaming we were passing at the exact moment on the highway, headed for Mexico, telling our own stories." End quote. Throughout the novel, heterosexual domestic space is represented antagonistically, as torn by conflict over the male's unwillingness to conform to the demands of domestic economy. The beat's anti-domestic stance leads to a misogynist and essentializing conception of gender roles. It privileges male emancipation at the expense of reducing females to two possible roles, as sexual objects or agents of domestication. Keeping with the scale of the Continental, I would like to turn to Ginsberg and explore the methods and politics of his employment of American space. Hull is a vast geographical survey of the United States in which deviant modes of sexual and political activities are mapped upon the American continent. Ginsberg insisted on anchoring each of his activities to a specifically named place has a political function, since both political and sexual deviations became subjected to mapping and surveying projects at the beginning of the Cold War. Senator Joseph McCarthy used maps to survey the spread of communism within the United States as part of his crusade against what he defined as anti-American activities. McCarthy and his allies tried to construct an American identity based on purity and wholeness. They posed communism and homosexuality as two equivalent forms of unnatural penetrations of the integrity of the national body from the outside. Ginsberg's mapping project aims to contest the logic of McCarthy's representation and its ideology of setting sexual and political difference outside the norm. His counter-geography aims to reestablish the Americanism of those excluded from the whole. In Hall, he represents himself in bed with a sick America and in the Rockland Mental Hospital, where Ginsberg was confined in 1947 to cure his homosexuality. I'm with you, quote, I'm with you in Rockland, where we hug and kiss the United States under our bed sheets, the United States that coughs all night and won't let us sleep, end quote. The body metaphor and its mechanism of exclusion are reversed as America is intimately laid in bed and nursed by a publicly proclaimed homosexual and communist. I will now turn to the next scale of American space, that of urban space. And as much as On the Road explores the openness of American continental space in both content and literary form, all four road trips end in New York. And okay, the geography of the novel is actually divided between movement on roads and life in cities, which points to the centrality of the city for Beat writers. They exhibited the desire to make the literature urban both in content and in form. Burroughs, for example, modeled the literary form of Naked Lunch upon the topology of urban space. He equated the novel's montage-like structure to a city plan. Quote, you can cut into Naked Lunch at any intersection point, end point. The fragmented nature of structure of Naked Lunch undermines the possibility of establishing a unifying and exclusionary point of view that defines narrative-based literature. Burroughs sets the city in opposition to suburban domestic space, which he condemned in the following words. It's like I can't breathe in the USA, especially in suburban communities. Palm Beach is a real horror. No slums, no dirt, no poverty. God, what a fate to live there. End quote. Since suburban space is shielded from conflict and difference, according to Burroughs, it has no political space, which exists only when there is disagreement and injustice. As a counterspace to the pacified suburb, beat writers explore the heterogeneous and conflicting space of the city as means for politicizing their art. The exploration of both the city and the highway as counter-spaces to domesticity is contradictory, considering that the car at that period was the very agent that promoted the physical and financial crisis of the American city. The imperative to restructure urban space to streamline automobile access provided the pretext for urban renewal project which rationalized and divided the city into discrete and homogeneous spaces according to race, class, and function. In this historical context, beat writers appear to inhabit those leftover spaces and populations that escaped modernization and were of no use for the capitalist system. Each beat writer would explore a different form of urban otherness. Kerouac was foremost interested in black urban culture. The cities that the narrator visits on the road were centers of bebop activity. And you can see he actually visits New York, Chicago, Denver, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, and New Orleans, all center of jazz activity at that time. And jazz is represented in its public dimension as an urban event, spilling from the stage into the street. On the Road also explores the spatial dynamics of racism by charting the spatial separation and housing conditions of people of color. Significantly, the first road trip was planned to end in Mill City, present-day Marine City, one of the few public housing projects built during the Second World War that enforced racial integration. Ginsberg's approach to the city was more concerned with the status of the body in relation to public space. Hull is populated with the marginal urban strata of addicts, sailors, queers, and political radicals. Alongside Ginsberg's attempt for a more inclusive representation of the city, he incorporates these rootless populations as a tactic for sexualizing public space. In Hull, public spaces such as parks, train stations, and the street are represented as sites where sexual energy is freely exchanged. This live recording of Ginsberg's reading of Hull demonstrates his commitment to integrate poetry into public space. The poem was composed in a feedback process in which the work was altered through a series of public and mechanical practices. Drafts of the poem were read in public and then rewritten again with the aid of a tape recorder. As a result, the auditory dimension of Hull has the quality of a sermon, a communal form of speech that was employed by civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King. Hull was directly implicated in the civil rights struggle, as the censorship trial that followed the banning of Hull established the precedent of placing literature under the protection of the First Amendment. Ginsberg's provocative sermon was intended in part to shock, but its full historical significance can be recuperated in relation to another mapping project that frames and informs the beat's sexual politics. Alfred Kinsey's survey of sexual behavior in the human male from 1948. Kinsey collected thousands of sexual histories nationwide, and you see also the insistence, just like in Hull, to collect cases from each state in the United States, however small. He found that the realities of sexual activity widely differed from the dominant moral conventions of the public and its legislators. As much as half of the male population had some kind of homosexual experience, thus jeopardizing the logic behind the exclusion of homosexuals as a distinct form of deviation. Moreover, he demonstrated that human sexuality cannot be classified into normal and deviant categories, since sexual desire can be creatively attached to a variety of objects and performed in multiple ways. Kinsey claimed that dominant conceptions of sexuality, which are always posed as natural, are in actuality the result of violent conflict between different sexual practices. In light of this biopolitical context, the sexualization of public space is intended to relocate sexual discourse from the privacy of normative domesticity to the political space of the city. Ginsberg's conception of the intimate metropolis employs sexuality as a revolutionary force that cannot be contained and disciplined. The urban space that embodied the power of the body to resist homogenization was Times Square, which is the final destination of 3 of the 4 road trips described in On the Road. It was where the 3 writers fraternized with renegade characters that trafficked in sex, drugs, and stolen goods. This is a quote from On the Road. Ritzy's bar is the hoodlum bar of the street around Times Square. There were wild Negro queers, solemn guys with guns, ship-packing seamen, thin non-committal junkies. Kinsey spent a lot of time in Ritzy's bar, interviewed some of the boys. I was there the night his assistant came in 1945, end quote. The Times Square district, which was shedding its pre-war glamorous identity as a center of bourgeois entertainment to become the epicenter of popular pleasure and illicit activity, demonstrates the Beat's conception of the intimate metropolis as a dialogical space that is overripe with bodily activity that cannot be contained by dominant codes of morality. The reference to the Kinsey survey enforces this reading, proposing that the impurity of urban space has the potential to contest the modernist logic of dividing social space into discrete functional categories. The questioning of the boundaries that are set to differentiate between private and public is most pronounced in the ways in which Beat writers inhabit their writer's room, the smallest scale of the Beat spatial project. Burroughs explored means for dissolving the autonomy of domestic space in the ways he inhabited his bedroom, which also served as his writing room. Quote, Interzone, 150 pages, all new, come like a dictation. I hardly get the time to eat and fuck. I had 2 boys that afternoon come to my room, and I'm about to throw them out. They interrupt the great work. End quote. He has a lot of discipline. See? Burroughs incorporated these diverse practices of living into the text to inform Naked Lunch's fictional space that he termed as Interzone, or the unlocked city. Quote, anyone comes into your room at any time, through the open doors, tables and booths, and bars, and kitchens and baths, copulating couples and rows of brass beds, people eating, talking, bathing back into the haze of smoke and steam. End quote. This space that collapsed the distinction between the house and the city is posed as a counter-space to domesticity, which Naked Lunch surveys in the following words. Into the interior, a vast subdivision, antenna of television to the meaningless sky. In life-proof houses, we hover over the young, stop up a little of what we can shut out. End quote. Burroughs diagnosed the intrusion of electronic mass media into domestic space as a shield that protects its inhabitants from any bodily engagement with a chaotic and pure exteriority. And as much as his private room is no longer private, Naked Lunch cannot be attributed to individual author. The text was collectively produced by a group of writers, Kerouac and Ginsberg included, who edited Burroughs' anarchic output into a publishable text, and it was Kerouac himself who invented its title. Burroughs' rewriting of domestic space to correspond with the concept of interchangeability has a disturbing and exploitive dimension. As intimacy is subjected to the rules of exchange, bodies that are bought on the marketplace become exchangeable and disposable after use. And in this respect, Ginsberg's conception of the writer's room put forward a more complex and, to my mind, more rewarding model of domesticity. Ginsberg, who worked for the advertisement industry prior to his conversion into literature, often employed photographic representations of beat activity to shape their public image. Significantly, he chose to represent the act of composing hall as taking place in the kitchen of an apartment he rented and shared with his lover, Kozlovsky. The homely environment contrasts with the poem's direct attack on domesticity as an extension of capitalism and Cold War military buildup, which you can read here in this quote. Ginsberg's mimicry of matrimonial domesticity can be read as a parody which aims to disrupt the artificial division of the social into separate domains of private and public space, which mask the economic substructure that binds them together. But another meaning altogether can be drawn from Ginsberg's choice to present the writing of Hall in such a homely context, as a gesture that purports to redeem the kitchen from its gendered identity. The post-war ideology of domesticity confined women to the role of household servants and consumers. Ginsberg transforms the kitchen from a space of exploitive labor and consumption into a space of creativity and freedom. The image of the naked couple has a redeeming potential for heterosexual matrimony, the possibility of establishing domestic life on gender equality by de-essentializing gender roles and spaces and expanding them to include other forms of sexuality and labor. This dialectical reading of Ginsberg's critique of domesticity points toward the way out of the problematic aspect of the Beat Project, in which the oppositional stance essentializes gender, marginality, and otherness. It is in the intimacy of the home, now fully publicized and brought into the politic sphere of conflict, that Ginsberg opens creative possibilities for inhabiting social space. Thank you.
I would like to invite all of the 6 speakers to come to the table. I hope you still have some energy to discuss the papers and then go for lunch.
Thanks.
It seems that this morning we had a real journey through scales, from the scale of the kind of membrane-like house that is to envelop the human body to the scale of the continent and the scale of the car as a kind of another paradigmatic image of domesticity. But nevertheless, I think that all of the papers, from many different perspectives and from many different points of view, I think they problematized actually the very distinction upon which that conference was kind of set, the distinction between public and private, the one and the many, individual and collective, inside, outside, and so on. And there were a couple of times, there were actually a few times that the term topology came up. And somehow most of the speakers and most of the papers implied or suggested a kind of continuity, kind of manifested in different special or formal or programmatic configurations. And I would like just to say that some between comment or question, or to open up the discussion, that within that kind of alternative reading of both domestic and urban, where one could start or begin to define, if any, boundaries, or or whether the terms public and private could still be used to describe this kind of new kind of conditions you seem to suggest or to describe. It's not simple.
Well,
But,
I was wondering, in fact, maybe if we pinpoint some of that a little bit. There was an issue that seemed to come up, and in some ways felt it running through quite a few of the papers, and it has to do with the way in which a condition in which drawing becomes part of the building of the city, or becomes necessary for the building of the city. That very condition where drawing starts to define the spaces that can be conceived is in a way what makes possible a series of different approaches to different scales. So there's a kind of question of the emergence of differentiation conceived through drawing that emerges in the 20th century, in some ways prefigured by what Katharina was showing in the ossification of the block around the turn of the century, and then turns into what Karen Yashka's paper sort of shows as the possibility of imagining the absorption of intimacy inside an urbanized conception of an intimate environment, which is really just a kind of extended home. And then on the other hand, Christopher, your way of conceiving the difference between these two figures from the middle of the 20th century, where the same kind of thing is taken up. A kind of system of drawing is that which is used to problematize the understanding of this public-private boundary and what is intimacy.
Well, maybe I can sort of begin to say something about, because I started very early. I think what was quite interesting to see that obviously the block is sort of taken up by the practice of architecture at quite a late stage. And it's only at that time that the line of dividing the domestic from the private become just a strategic one. So, for instance, if we have readings that see the line representative of a closure, it can only come into being by the time in which drawing of the line is always strategic to the practice of architecture. So anyway, but that's something that only, it seems to me, emerges around 1890, 1900. It was a very late development, which sort of tend to overlook because of that.
I'd just like to offer a comment really about terms, and probably following on from what Marina was saying initially. And one specific comment on the concept of the interior. And I was intrigued by Katharina's idea or development of the argument about the conceptualization of urbanism at a particular time in the 19th century and how we might in some ways still be held within the sway of that conceptualization. I'd propose that the interior as a concept has a particular historical conceptualization at the beginning of the 19th century. And it's actually in a kind of splitting away from architectural concerns. And the way I think about it is that the interior is a space that is created that is in addition to a given inside space. It's not the inside space provided on the architectural plan, but that is the prerequisite then for the addition of the interior. And I think this gets back to what Walter Benjamin was really saying about how one inhabits the interior, that this 19th century bourgeois concept is one of covering the hard surface, the hard architectural surface, with the soft stuff of furnishing. So from the beginning of the 19th century, you have the development of the profession of interior decoration splitting away from the profession of architecture, and this kind of professional antagonism that obtains between the two at this time. Now, why I think this is important, it's not necessarily important in its own right, is to say that the interior then cannot be subsumed necessarily within architectural concerns, that it involves issues of the immaterial, of projection, and I was interested by Paul Emmons' reading of Robert Kerr. Robert Kerr is someone who mentioned that one had to imaginatively inhabit the plan, and that was in a sense beyond his technique of an architect, as an architect to organise, that was a relationship between himself and the client, a kind of negotiation of what would come in the future. So that the interior, it's sort of doubled between, it's put off, it's doubled between a kind of material possibility and an imaginative possibility, and I think that's what's held within Benjamin's account. But that it cannot be essentialized. It's not a dwelling space. Okay? It's very much about historical conditions and about certain antagonisms with architecture as well. So I guess all I'm saying that maybe the panel might comment on is that at this term we can be quite specific about at least one term, that it's not interchangeable with domesticity, with the public, the private, with architecture itself, but it seems to me that we could possibly be historically specific about that, as we are about urbanism. I think that's what Katharina raised.
Yeah, Larry, I wanted to add something to your comment about drawing, and that's writing too, especially in Roy's piece. And I find for myself that writing as well as drawing are crucial tools.
I've got a question. Actually, I don't know. I'm learning to do this. I've got a question, but I really want to provoke a kind of discussion between Chris, Alan, and Paul, because I think there's some things that kind of work through the papers that Chris has asked this question that I think it would be interesting to discuss. For
in answer to the, well, not the semi-accusation, I don't like the house. I do, I love the house. I'm just so used to, I suppose, it being sneered at by a lot of people as being a kind of a first-year architecture student's attempt at non-rectilinear design, you know, and I suppose I started off defensively almost, but I think it's because Kiesler's 1950, the ultimate egg, it doesn't yield the possibility of this outward and inward flow at all, and yet he claims it does in his writings and whatnot, and his concurrent projects or whatever. And then he really begins to get interesting when he starts to manipulate these so-called, well, they were kind of before his time, but you know, the topological or whatever, with the 1959. So, and in terms of, I thought I touched on the fact that he is quite prophetic in this, in the fact of, there's an, even in terms of archigram, and then say the unprivate house exhibition in MoMA, if you saw it, there was just like billions of tourist type constructions, or well, 3 or 4 anyway. So yeah, that's just a kind of a defense of that. And in terms of organising or getting a discussion going, and what do you guys have to say?
Well, there's no question that ideas of flow have become very popular again today, and part of the reason why I crafted the paper in the way in which I did that is to emphasize that there is historical thought behind these things, and so often in the rush to make dramatic novel forms, we forget about the intellectual heritage of these ideas. So I intentionally stepped away from some of the more present interests in it to be able to give a little bit more depth to it. And there's no question that ideas of flow work with the network scheme, which is by its nature topologic, because that's where the relationship between points and lines that connect them can be manipulated, twisted, bent, moved across multiple dimensions that can exist in many different geometries. The fundamental problem, it seems to me, is that in contemporary architecture, we still have a cosmologic orientation, just as ancient architectures did. But now our image of the body and image of the cosmos is a network which has no structure in and of itself. So unlike the traditional notions of the body, we can't turn to that to have an image by which we structure our world around us. And I think that's the problem that was talked about by Chris in his paper.
Well, I don't know. I think I would resist that, actually. Because, I mean, this paper, in a way, is a footnote to a longer examination of how those cosmological ideas of the body are also constructions of modernity, rather than some sort of transcendental, eternal sort of schema. They have a historicity. So I'm not really. I mean, I wouldn't want to make an argument. I wouldn't want the paper to be interpreted, or I wouldn't want to go along with the interpretation that, in a way, I'm drawing out a certain attack on sort of a phenomenological subject by modernity, but looking at the formation of different types of schemas of corporeality and subjectivity, I suppose.
Just as a point of clarification, I didn't intend to suggest that there is a transcendental ahistorical structure to any schema. I think they're all highly grounded in their historical constructs.
But the other thing is, I mean, for me, I guess the role of history is rather different. I think in the paper, it's for me. I mean, I think Katharina and I is probably our AA heritage or something. But you know, the history of modernity that sort of I try to present is a history of the present, or a history of the future. It's a history whose construction is about the present possibility of a certain field of questions and disagreements and arguments. So it's curious when I mean a lot of my work is in terms of research looks at the middle of the 20th century. While I also teach design and of course in design, and we're looking at a lot of the new digital informatic models as well in the design. And I always, the way I sort of treat it is not as, oh look, we've been here before, we've done it all before, but in fact the questions that modernity pose get refracted through a certain reconfiguration of that space of knowledge, I suppose. It's, I know it's a difficult question. I mean, to me, there's a difference in looking at the work, right? Whether it's one of the interesting things about Bannon's, I think Bannon's argument, and it really is a throwaway. It's one of his brilliant throwaway lines that the Smithson's work is topological. I mean, he says it, he makes a couple sentences, and then he basically moves on. It's pretty provocative, right, to see how this thing, which doesn't resemble a Klein model, doesn't resemble a Mobius strip, it doesn't have the iconography of topology, but the implication is it's organizationally and performatively topological. I think that's a really important implication, both in the way we conceptualize architecture today, but also when we're looking at works of the past. Just because it resembles something doesn't necessarily mean it's operating that way. And I wonder if topology itself isn't always the same sort of. It's not the same thing. Just like the interior is, like Charles points out, it isn't a static thing, right? It's formulated at a certain point in time. It has a sort of genealogy. Topology in architecture. I mean, it would be an interesting task to construct a genealogy of topology in modern architectural thought and trace, when it becomes possible to think of this and how the term is operating in various different discourses. But because the thing that strikes me about Kiesler's house is it's actually not very topological in many ways.
The second house.
Well, I don't know, both. It seems rather untopological.
Question? It's a kind of general question or observation on most of the papers, which seem to be viewing the question of public and private as something which we talked about as an autonomous architectural question, and there seems to be generally a lack of commentary about capitalist spatial relations and property ownership, which seem to be something which determines almost all of the things which are being discussed. And I wondered if it's something which was deliberately being marginalised in order to be able to talk about other things, or, I mean, do you think it's interesting?
Brian? Does anyone want to? Well, I mean, I think there is also a danger implied in that of sort of saying that they are the capitalist forces which sort of act their way upon architecture. And I think in some of the papers at least, including mine, I think what's sort of a bit undervalued is the very profound strategic linkage of space and economics. So I think the traditional model of saying it's, capitalism culture in the 19th century, proliferated everywhere, you've got speculation, blah, 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 etc. So this traditional account sort of really falls short of what the spatial question brings into being, and the kind of spatial elaboration of population flows, also a 19th century topic, and the whole way in which we configure our society, or it comes into being. So in a way, there are histories to be told in which all of those distinctions can be undercut. So in a way, again, it's probably a 20th century question that you're asking.
But, well, it's meant to be quite an open question. One of the things I think is an interesting way in which it's figured is through the network, which is one of the formal figures which occurred in a number of papers. And one of the things which seems to be interesting is the way in which the network has only been able to realise itself as a non-material thing. The kind of networks which are being proposed.
Oh no, the networks are absolutely material.
Couldn't realise themselves simply because they came against certain patterns of property ownership.
But one of the implications of network is that it in a way redistributes those legal. I mean, I agree. I think the legal boundedness, right, of always in stake, and it's very unclear, right? Sometimes how, who owns, in the Golden Lane, for example, who owns those trays of quasi-public space, right? It's not the street, right? But I want to. They are holy material in a way. They're always already sort of refused by material, and they cut out from under, in a way, the private ownership, in the sense that you can be in your own private bourgeois interiority, but actually that is one of the sites par excellence for the consuming sort of global subject. So even though you're in this private space, you're actually in a space of control that's constantly sort of, you're a productive citizen within your own domesticity, so you're always already in a way locked into a broader network. So it's a complex kind of condition.
Brian's trying to ask a question.
Well, it seems to me that a lot of the conversation about topology and continuity returns to that phrase, which I don't know who coined it, from the 50s, propinquity without adjacency. And it seems to me that what one turn in topological discourse that hasn't been mentioned yet is Christopher Alexander's essay, "The City is Not a Tree," which I took to be a critique of configurative discipline, which one can put on one side of the Smithsons and the Unité, but on the other side there's the Elvis plan, where Corbusier had imagined the road, the highway, as a kind of megastructure in which some kind of post-colonial adjacency was possible, where you could put in your own sort of little kind of house in the middle of a general megastructure. Now, the odd thing about Christopher Alexander's essay to me is that in a way it completely seems to dematerialize any possibility of the network, because it says, well, the city is connection of, or interconnection of rhizomatic communications which never can be spatialized in the same way that a telephone call can't be. As when somebody phones up somebody here on a mobile phone in the middle of a lecture from another country. And once you accept the sort of intervening, the supervening significance of immaterial communications, it really sends any configurative disciplining, including topological disciplines, into a really impossible situation, I would have thought.
Well, I mean, there was the quote, I guess it was in the epigraph of my text from Hight and Negri, who do say the network is if the panopticon was the ideal, the model diagram for Foucault of sort of a disciplinary space, the network is the ideal architectural, not the ideal, but is the architectural diagram for their vision of empire, which is delirious and very problematic. But they make a very good point. It's anti-architectural, right? Which is something that Virilio has been claiming for a long time. There is this complete. It's almost impossible to imagine, right, what the figuring spatial discourse is of that condition. So I think a lot of the interest today in topology is there's this move to trying to understand, basically in the way that topology defines objects, not by their form, but by the moment at which new information has to arrive from outside the system, outside that network, to transform it. Right? You can turn a donut into a coffee cup in topology, and it's actually the same thing, right? Even though they look different. It's only when you have to cut that surface to create a discontinuity in the system. In other words, add more information into it, that you actually produce real difference in topological schema. And I think that's the task is in a way to find those kind of modes of operation, where the differentiation occurs, where the information has to no longer just be modulated, but actually disrupted and torqued along itself. And that's I don't know if that helps at all. But. So there's frictions that become productive in a way.
I'm afraid that should be the last question because it's almost 2 o'clock.
This is just to follow up on this notion that you just alluded to regarding the potential for this mega scale of the highway. It's directed to Roy, and that is that on one hand there are these in-car vignettes that Kerouac writes about that comprise part of his trips versus the larger scale aspect or another scale which are reflected in these nodes, these stops along his trips in St. Louis. I think it was St. Louis, possibly Lawrence, I don't know, but you alluded to jazz culture, etc. And I wonder if, because visually there seems to be an obscuring of this more intimate scale in the car, in these lines that were drawn across the map. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how these two scales are mediated in your opinion, how you interpret these mediations, if there is a mediation.
And one of the reasons that I posed the Balzacian project against the Kerouac project, or how he poses himself, because in the section where he doesn't stop in those stopping places in the cities, he's not interested at all in the way also he describes the movement. He's not interested in what is happening outside the car. So in a way, to inhabit the continental space is actually to be in the domestic space of the car. So it's only the conversations that are happening in the car, all the other activity that the car produces, or the communal aspect of the car. And so paradoxically, when you inhabit the continental space, you're actually at home. You're able to be at home through this system.
Does he actually draw the links between the advertisements, those visual imaginings of these, domestic moments in the car, and the textual descriptions?
Well, the beat writers are very aware. They read Time Life all the time, and they talk about these pictures, not unlike the independent group, but also use these images, but for a different meaning. So they're also doing their kind of research of popular culture, but it's not. They don't really. They're not fascinated by popular culture like the independent group will be, and also their fascination with time scale is very different. It's not about the iconographic aspect or the visual aspect of that space, but more about the social and the bodily relation, the kind of activity that happens there. So in a way, they're very iconoclastic. They don't really care about how things appear, but how they're being used.
But I think in the afternoon, I mean, scales of mediation will be discussed more, because now it was more the scale of extension this morning.
Well, we'll take a break for lunch now and plan to come back at 2:40, so 10 minutes later than shown on the schedule. We'd like to thank our 6 speakers very much.